Hello and welcome to Telesur. I'm Ian Bruce and this is Interviews from Quito, the program where we explore some of the big challenges facing this country and the region. In today's program, the midterms in the United States. What do they mean for Trump? What do they mean for the new left in the United States? And what impact, if any, could they have here in Latin America? To talk about this, we're joined by my colleague, Michael Blosser. He's the coordinator of social media here at Telesur in English, but he's also been an active participant and organizer in the US left, including the Occupy movement. But first, let's take a look at this video.
As we fight to protect our immigrant families, our neighbors, our children, our planet, our communities, I promise to always have your back.
After Tuesday's midterm elections, Democrats have taken control of the House of Representatives, while Republicans have expanded their majority in the Senate. Democrats have taken 221 seats in the lower chamber, gaining 3 more seats than was needed to control it. This is the first time in 8 years the House of Representatives is under the control of Democrats, which will restrict President Donald Trump's ability to pass his proposals through Congress. But in the Senate, Republicans have won 51 seats, taking enough to control the chamber against the 46 seats the Democrats have taken.
Thanks, Michael. Let's start with the big picture. Everybody said these midterms were going to be a referendum on the presidency of Donald Trump. Were they? What was the verdict?
Yes and no. And so, like you said, this election was all about Trump. And so it invigorated all the people that were against everything that Trump stood for and brought them out in huge numbers to the election to vote against Trump. But also at the same time, it did bring about a lot of his supporters. They're energized by Trump to go out and vote for his candidates as well.
So that high turnout came from both sides?
Yes. The early voting numbers were record early voting numbers that came out. But clearly in key contests such as the governor race in Florida, where a Trump-like candidate was running against a very progressive Bernie Sanders-like candidate, both sides came out in huge numbers to vote for their candidate.
So the verdict, because it didn't seem to be the kind of devastating defeat for Trump that I think many on the liberal establishment were hoping for.
Well, of course, Trump is trying to frame it as a victory for himself and for his administration, and that's not true, like everything he says. Because while it wasn't a blue wave that the kind of liberals and the Democratic establishment is saying, it was more of a blue splash. It was still hurt Trump, in that the Democrats won some key governorships in key states, and of course they won back the House, which will provide a huge, roadblock for Trump to enact some of these very, laws that he's been pushing these past 2 years.
Well, come back to the House, but the Senate, the Senate actually became more Trump-like, correct?
Yeah, the Senate was reinforced for Republicans.
But not just for the Republicans. If I'm not mistaken, the senators, the Republican senators that lost tended to be the more kind of middle-of-the-roads Republicans, and the ones that won tended to be more kind of Tea Party-ish. Is that right?
Yeah, and so I think it's a clear sign for how the strategy should go forward for the U.S. left, in that there were a lot of center-right, moderate Democrat senators, such as in Missouri, in Florida, and Indiana, that lost to more Trump-like supporters. And the Senate became more Trump-like, became more Republican. Of course, the Democrats were defending more seats than the Republicans, so it was initially against them anyway. But yeah, the fact that the Senate became more Republican is a huge victory for Trump, and that now he can push forward his judges, not just for the Supreme Court if another opening comes up, but also for the federal, and national and state level, which plays a huge factor in how districts and voting districts are set up in other justice system situations in the United States.
So how does that kind of contradictory situation play out in terms of what he can and can't do? So on the one hand, you have a more Trump-like Senate. On the other hand, he's lost control of the lower house. Does that impose more constraints on what he can do, or will he be encouraged to press ahead with some of his more?
Well, I don't think anyone knows what Trump's going to do, but it does put a lot of restraints on certain things. Of course, he still has his executive orders. He still has, like the judge, assignments that only the Senate votes on, but he also can't pass his laws that the House and the Senate need to pass, especially since in the House now we have a lot of very progressive, very leftist, and even now some socialist candidates that won in the House, pushing the House way more to the left than it has been ever, making them more and more likely to actually resist Trump. More so than
I want to come back to those socialist candidates in a moment, but what exactly can the House do to stop Trump's policies?
For example, let's talk about a huge law that Trump passed. He passed this huge tax bill, basically for the wealthy and the elite, that because the House and the Senate was in the hands of Trump, he needed both chambers in order to pass that law. Now that the House is in the Democrats, there's no way he can pass a law like that that only benefits the rich, that only benefits his right-wing policies. The same with a bunch of his other policies. For immigration law, if he tries to, as he's proposed, to end birthright citizenship, there's no way he can pass that. Because in order to change the Constitution, which is the birthright citizenship is in the Constitution, you need the House and the Senate to both pass that.
So what about the famous wall? Because he's just been talking about that again, and then he's prepared to see government shut down if the House doesn't back his funding for the wall.
Basically, the left wing, or the more to the left the House has become, puts an end to his wall idea. Because of course, both chambers have to pass his budget. And if Trump doesn't have money for the wall, then he can't build the wall. And so he can talk as much as you want to rile up his anti-immigrant supporters, but there's nothing he really can do without a budget and without passing that kind of legislation through both the Senate and the House.
What about the migrant caravan? We've been covering that. Obviously, we've been looking at it a lot over the last few weeks. Trump, from the Latin American perspective, obviously it's a hugely important, phenomenon, event. But Trump, from the opposite point of view, put it right at the center of the midterm campaign. Is that just going to go away for Trump now because he can't do anything about it, or what?
I don't think so. I think Trump, he's a media person. He knows how to rile up his supporters. And of course, he decides to bring up the caravan using a lot of fake news, saying there's terrorists in the caravan, that they were going to steal our jobs and all these things in order to rile up his supporters to get them out to vote. And that's what happened, And so I think, especially now since he had a defeat in the House, he had a defeat in certain governor races as well, he's going to, especially closer to 2020, he's going to keep trying to rile people up and say that these immigrants, such as the migrant caravan, are going to come and destroy the U.S. way of life.
But he's already sent some 5,000 troops to the border. He talked about possibly up to 15,000 troops on the border. Mm-hmm. That caravan could reach the border in the coming weeks. What happens then? Is he still got the same space to maneuver and do what he wants to do as he had before?
Yes and no. With internal domestic policies like that, the president unfortunately does have the ability to tell where the troops go, how many troops to go. But at the same time, the House can pass laws to block him from doing that. They can actually, certain of these leftist socialist candidates campaign on abolishing ICE and against the conditions that the migrants were found in the children in the cages, and they can pass these laws. But of course, now that it's a separate chamber with the Senate controlled by Republicans and the House controlled by the Democrats, where it's kind of a...
Does that mean gridlock, or will they negotiate some kind of compromise?
I hope it's gridlock, because unfortunately Nancy Pelosi, who is now back to being the Speaker of the House, and then Chuck Schumer, the Senate Minority Leader, are traditional corporate, very center-right, pro-capitalist Democrat politicians. They have said that they are willing to work with Trump. But hopefully the new progressive young candidates like Ocasio-Cortez or Rashida Tlaib, that are open socialist, open leftist, that are now a huge part of the House, will not listen to Pelosi and will resist Trump in any way that they can.
What about other policies towards Latin America? For example, the sanctions on Venezuela, that kind of thing. Do the midterm results have any impact on those sorts of things?
They definitely do. So, of course, as we saw with Venezuela and now with Iran, the President of the United States with huge executive power can pass certain sanctions against certain members of those governments. But in order to pass a huge sanctions law or something more like the Cuba blockade, it has to go through both the House and the Senate. And so if Trump tries to increase the sanctions of Venezuela, or even talk about a military invasion in Venezuela, he needs the approval of Congress, and that's both houses. And so the House can completely block bigger sanctions and military involvement in Venezuela, which would be a huge victory for.
They could actually block it completely.
Yes, he has to pass it through the House and the Senate for the most overdeveloping,
The most aggressive form.
the most aggressive form of sanctions. Yeah.
Right. And the Cuban blockade is interesting, isn't it? Because if I'm not mistaken, at least this is what I remember from when Obama was in office, you know, he always said he couldn't lift the blockade on Cuba, only the House could lift the blockade on Cuba. Does that mean that an initiative in the House could actually roll back the blockade on Cuba in spite of Trump?
Yes. I don't see it happening anytime soon, unfortunately. The Democrats don't have an overwhelming majority in the House. They do have the majority. But there's still, even though they have new progressive leftist, Congress people in the House, there's still those center-right Congress people that very much are still very much aware, like scared of the Cuba embargo situation. But a good sign is that this can build to 2020, where we can get more leftist and progressive candidates in the House, win back the Senate, and possibly having an open socialist or a progressive in the presidency. And that would 100% be open to removing the Cuba embargo.
I mean, things are shifting on that level in the States anyway, aren't they? I mean, the governor race in Florida, although the progressive Democrat candidate didn't win, seemed to show a different Florida to the one we're used to thinking of purely kind of anti-Cuban, anti-Castro sort of forces. It must be a lot more diverse now.
It's changing a lot, and especially it's changing in the Cuban U.S. citizens there. So of course, the Cuban U.S. citizens traditionally have been a very far-right, reactionary base. They were the only Latino base, actually, the only Latino community to vote Republican. But since Obama and since the new opening of the relationships with Cuba, and that the younger generation being more open to socialism, being more open to dialogue, the young generation of Cubans are more and more likely to vote Democrat. And so that's a huge change that could help Florida turn blue. But at the same time, the fact that there's progressives like Andrew Gillum running can energize not only the Latino base, but young people who now, in numerous polls, prefer socialism over capitalism in the United States.
Let's move on to that, because I think that obviously is one of the most surprising and interesting, developments in these midterms and in the last few years. Because, I don't know, not even 4 or 5 years ago, the notion of openly socialist people being elected to Congress was, pretty far out. I mean, all right, I suppose Bernie Sanders did call himself, but he was like the one, the one token socialist in Congress, And now we're seeing something really quite different.
Yeah.
What is it? What are we seeing?
Well, I think there's everyone, especially the young in the United States, are just sick of the status quo. And so even with Obama and then the Hillary Clinton campaign, they ran a very neoliberal status quo campaign. Of course, Trump's slogan was "Make America Great Again." Hillary's slogan was "America's already great." But to hundreds of millions of U.S. citizens, that just wasn't true. Where the income inequality kept growing, or the young are loaded with all this student debt, and they have underemployment, and they have numerous master's degrees, but they can't find a good job. They've become very more open to these ideas, where they believe that everyone has a right to healthcare, everyone has a right to a free education, everyone has a right to affordable housing and a good job. And so these socialist ideas that a majority of the U.S. actually supports now,
not with the name socialism, right?
without the name socialist, are now being understood that these are actually socialist ideas. Thanks to Bernie Sanders, who kind of brought back the word socialism. Before, of course, with the Red Scare and just the Cold War, socialism was this evil, scary word in the United States. But since Bernie Sanders, it's no longer such a shame to be a socialist or to be a leftist in the United States. And you can see that with, like I said, the polls of the millennial generation now prefers socialism over capitalism. And there's this huge growth in socialist organizations such as Democratic Socialists of America, which now has over 50,000 members and is the largest social organization since the 1920s, since the times of Eugene Debs. And so that's really exciting.
So, all right, there was the Bernie Sanders campaign, but let's sort of wind back a bit further. So if you go back 10 years, the left in the US was, you know, a fairly large number of very, very small groups, right? Well, I think very small groups, yeah? What happened, you know, even before the Sanders campaign that prepared the ground for this, you know, surprising emergence of, like, the DSA, 50,000 members in a year?
Well, I think the U.S. has always had a tough political situation for the left because there's been, for the longest time, been a two-party system where money is in politics, where big money matters, and the Democrats were supposed to be the left party, have, since the time of Bill Clinton, moved more and more farther to the right. And now they're considered more of a center-right party, and the Republicans as well have moved forward to the right wing. And for a lot of people, even for a very conservative country, such as the United States, a lot of people saw themselves not being represented by either Democrats or the Republicans. And they saw that their standard of living kept dropping, and that they didn't have a job, and that all this wealth kept going to the rich, which is why this huge Occupy movement erupted in 2011.
But even going back some years, there's always been that sort of a candidate, I don't know, Ralph Nader, the Green Party candidate, that supposedly was trying to tap into that.
Yeah.
But it never really meant much, did it?
Well, the problem with Ralph Nader is that it's really the electoral system in the United States is built so that third parties can't really have a real chance at the presidency. And so he basically was already disqualified by running in the Green Party. And so what Sanders decided to do, even though he still identifies as an independent, in which a lot of Democratic Socialists of America candidates are now doing, is they're still independent, they're still Democratic Socialists of America, but they're running as Democrats, because it's the only way for them to get elected in this current political system in the United States.
I think we need to explain that, because I must say, I've always found that quite difficult to understand. So they're not members of the Democratic Party, but they run as Democrats. Is that right?
They're both. And so in order to run as a member of the Democrat Party, at least for certain states, you have to register as a Democrat. For Bernie, I think it's more complicated because he's never been a Democrat, but he's able to run as a Democrat as a president. That was a different case. But yeah, there's currently a debate still inside the group of either to running as a third party or to run as Democrats. And it seems that the best way forward, at least now, until a different opening happens, is to be open and proud Democratic Socialists of America members that run as Democrats.
Right. So let's just go through, you know, in case people missed it, who was elected of this new wave of, you know, socialist, progressive candidates? Who are we seeing now in elected positions?
So tons of progressive candidates from diverse backgrounds, from indigenous backgrounds, women of color, Muslim, LGBTQ candidates. Historically, the most ever were elected in to political office in the United States, and so that's a huge thing. But also,
there's at local level, right? State.
No, there was. I'm talking about national, state, and local, and so I'm just talking about using the big word progressive as a whole, and so some including people that don't identify as socialists, but identify as progressives and agree with a lot of socialist policies that come from these diverse backgrounds, from being from indigenous Native American, from being from a Muslim woman, from being a refugee, from being LGBTQ. They won in record numbers nationally, state, and locally, and I think that's exciting. But also even more exciting is that we have 10 open socialists, in addition to Bernie, of course, that won in the national and state level. We had two win in the House.
Two members of the House.
Two members of the House.
Alexandria
Ocasio-Cortez in New York, and Rashida Tlaib in Michigan, who also is a
who are explicitly DSA.
Explicitly DSA members, proud socialist. And they both have very interesting backgrounds. You know, Ocasio-Cortez is a young Latina background, open socialist. Rashida Tlaib is a Muslim, Palestinian U.S. citizen, open socialist, also young. But then we also had up to 10, maybe 11, depending on how the rest of the election results turn out, state senators and congresspeople that are also DSA, open socialist members, including someone like Julia Salazar, which overwhelmingly beat a corporate Democrat in her state Senate race in New York. And she also comes from a very diverse background with her Latina background as well.
I mean, obviously that's an extraordinary novelty in US politics, but what can they actually do? I mean, what can two socialists in the House of Representatives, or one or two in this or that state legislature actually do?
Well, they've already started talking about, there's already a progressive caucus. And so that it includes people that identify as progressives, that may not, at least now, until it becomes more common, identify as socialist. But now the progressive caucus in the House is a third of the House, a third of the Democrats in the House. Really? And so they have a huge weight, and beforehand they didn't really use it a lot. Now they can start dictating, instead of Nancy Pelosi and the corporate leaders of the House, they can say, hey, no, this is not who we stand for, we're standing with the people, and this is what we're going to do. And since they now have a third of the Democrats in the House, that's a huge weight.
Also, can they propose legislation?
They talked about, they campaigned on it. And so, like I said, Rashida Tlaib and Ocasio-Cortez ran on the campaign for universal health care, which is also what Bernie has proposed. Because even though Obamacare was passed, it's still a very bad system with a lot of people still uninsured in the richest country of the world, which is a huge shame. They campaigned on abolishing ICE. They campaigned on free education. They campaigned on $15 minimum wage. They campaigned on a tax on the rich and the corporations in order to raise funds, in order to give people jobs, in order to help the working and the middle class in the United States.
But it's going to be a kind of propaganda presence in the House. I mean, they're going to make arguments. They're going to raise arguments that nobody else was raising before. But they won't actually be able to achieve results, will they?
We'll see. I mean, I think the biggest factor is that these type of candidates that have won or is the new way forward for the U.S. left. And they can open the doors for even more of these candidates in 2020. But surprisingly, maybe due to Sanders' support, who's the most supported politician in the U.S. right now, and Ocasio-Cortez and all these open socialists, their huge victories, is that most of the presidential contenders for the Democrats right now are running on the same platform. They're talking about raising the minimum wage. They're talking about universal health care. They're talking about giving jobs and taxing the rich. And this never would have happened to Democrats during the time of Hillary Clinton and before that. And now that this has become more of a general platform for the Democrats, it clearly shows where the shift is going.
I want to get a bit more into what kind of a sort of program vision the DSA has, and maybe by reference back to, you yourself were involved in the Occupy movement. I'm not sure to what extent you think maybe the Occupy movement itself was kind of the sort of launching pad for this kind of emergence of a new left. But they seem to have very different strategic visions. I mean, Occupy was a kind of anti-politics movement, right? It had no intention or interest in participating in electoral politics. It was a movement, And now we've had this sort of shift into sort of parliamentary politics, if you like. Is that the strategy of DSA? We will achieve socialism through Congress? Is that?
I think that's a positive and negative aspect for a lot of leftists in the United States. Of course, I've been the Occupy movement, which is a very organic, spontaneous movement that brought in everyone from the left. You brought in anarchists, to super leftists, to socialists, to democratic socialists, to liberals. They all came together, because we knew something terrible was happening in the United States, and the wealth inequality, and with the recession, people losing their jobs, and the rich just taking people's houses, all these things. But at the same time, it kind of faded away because there wasn't any electoral support behind it. And I think even though a lot of US leftists reject electoral participation, especially with the Democrats, which is still very much of a capitalist party, very much a status quo party, very much an imperialist party, we have to win elections as well, and not only just to have power on the streets, but to have power in Congress and in political office. And I think what the DSA is doing, which is very different from the Green Party, which isn't very active, in my opinion, and just launches presidential candidates every 4 years. DSA is working with working class communities, is going to marginalized communities, is in the streets.
I was going to ask that, because is there a danger that these figureheads, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Julia Salazar, whoever, will get kind of just sucked into the sort of mechanisms of, parliamentary routine and so on
No,
and so
of course,
forth. And that sort of movement stuff, the kind of connection on the streets gets lost?
Of course, I think it's a huge, especially since, even though it's a huge first for the US for having all these open socialists in a national and state level, there's still not very many of them, But I think Ocasio-Cortez and Rashida and Julia Salazar recognize where their base comes from. It comes from the people on the street, from the communities that they met, from the diverse communities, from the leftists that knocked on the doors for their campaigns. And so I think there is a risk that they become kind of mainstreamized in US politics. It destroys a lot of leftists that way. But at the same time, DSA is going to continue to grow. And under a year and a half, they grew to 50,000 members. By 2020, maybe there'll be 100,000 members. And if their celebrity or figurehead politicians don't, perform the way that the membership wants them to, then they'll have to answer to the members, and the DSA will put forth, or other socialist organizations will put forth other socialist candidates.
Is it conceivable we could see a DSA presidential candidate?
Anytime soon? I don't think so. I think the closest we can get to an open socialist candidate, president, is Bernie Sanders. But I don't think he would identify himself as a
probably a bit too old now?
No, I don't think he would join the DSA. But he identifies...
too old to stand again, to run again for president?
No, he's actually younger than Trump, if I remember. Because Trump is a very old president. And the thing with Bernie, to me, is very similar to the situation in the UK with Jeremy Corbyn. They're two very old, white men, but they've had the same principles their whole lives. They've been fighting for human rights, for civil rights, and they've been open Marxists and socialists their whole life, and most of their support comes from the youth. And as more and more youth get involved into this electoral process, the more chance that Bernie has of not only winning the youth and the diverse candidates that the Democrats are looking for, but also bringing back the working class, which the Democrats, since the time of Bill Clinton, have basically lost.
So 2020, Bernie Sanders for president, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez for vice president?
We'll see.
I think we're out of time, Michael.
Yeah.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
We've been talking to Michael Borsa about the meaning of the midterm elections in the United States and their impact here in Latin America and beyond. Thank you very much for watching Interviews from Quito. I'm Bruce. Until next time.